Hello, welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's political debate show looking at issues in the Middle East. President Putin's visit to Egypt continued as his counterpart Abdel-Fattah el-Sissi rolled out more red carpet in Cairo. Throughout this full charm offensive, the two leaders are discussing a boost in trade ties and possibly dumping the US dollar, switching to their national currencies for bilateral trade. And one of the biggest deals on the table is a multi-billion-dollar arms deal. Let me now welcome our guest here at the studio, Egyptian-British political analyst, Mr. Omar Ismail. Thank you very much for being on the show. And Mr. Marko Gasic, political analyst. Thank you very much as well. Before we get into looking at this visit and its regional and global implications, let's have a look at this brief report on this top Middle East event this week.
Egyptian President Abdel-Fattah el-Sissi welcomed Russia's President Vladimir Putin this week in Cairo as the two leaders sought to strengthen ties between the two nations. The Russian leader was given a 21-gun salute as he was driven through the driveway of the presidential palace, flanked by soldiers on horseback. He was greeted by Sisi and cheering children waving the Russian flag and an off-key rendition of Russia's national anthem. Several Cairo highways were lined with posters of Mr. Putin's face, and he was given a hero's welcome in the state-run media. The meeting of the leaders was exceptionally warm. After holding talks at Cairo's international airport, both leaders proceeded to Cairo Opera House for a cultural evening and were then snapped enjoying what appeared to be a romantic meal for two overlooking views of the Nile. United by a deep hostility toward Islamists, Egypt's President Abdel-Fattah el-Sissi and Russia's Vladimir Putin said they were both committed to fighting the threat of terrorism. The general and the former KGB officer found common ground on security at talks in Cairo that signaled a rapprochement between their two countries at a time when relations between Egypt and the United States have cooled. Putin, making his first state visit to Egypt in a decade, said they agreed on reinforcing efforts in combating terrorism. Officials say the warmth of Mr. Putin's welcome does not signal a shift in Cairo's foreign policy, with a Western diplomat saying historically Egypt has been playing this game before, when it shifted between the Soviets and the Americans. They are both playing nations against each other.
Mr. Omar Ismail, how do you look at this President Putin's visit to Egypt?
I think the visit itself carries a significant importance to both countries, challenges in both countries. Egypt is facing horrendous terrorism, and the economy is not doing as well as it should do. Russia too has having problem as far as the Balkan, and obviously the action that the American and the European are taking against what's happening in Ukraine. So the two countries now, I think, they found themselves in a difficult position, and I think the visit itself would help economically in terms of development, moving the relationship forward. The economic, I call it the economic soft power that would create perhaps a strategic partnership between Egypt and the Russian Federation in the foreseeable future, particularly in the field of energy, which is Egypt suffers from electricity cuts, as we know, the need for renewable energy in terms of the nuclear power generating electricity, as well as the investment in the infrastructure in Egypt, and likewise investment in Russia by Egyptian, which would help the two economies. And the fact that the two countries as well agreed to ditch the dollar, it helped both countries. But I'm not quite sure on how far that would go.
Marko Gasic, do you think this was a much needed visit, particularly at this moment on time?
Well, it's one of those interesting moments in history when perhaps we've got a change from one system to another. I mean, you've got the Western economic model hasn't worked for perhaps Egypt as we've seen over the last decades, as over a period of successive rulers. You could say that Egypt is looking for a new idea, and the new idea may well be to turn eastward and to engage with the new trading blocks that are going to be formed, because I think for Egypt, as for many countries, it would be very difficult to be outside these trading blocks once they start making arrangements which are to their own benefit. So Egypt now has the benefit of being not only effectively in the Eurasian Union, but also linked in that way through Russia as one of the main players in that union, with the BRIC countries, with the Shanghai Cooperation Council. So it's a chance for Egypt to come in early, and perhaps while the rules of these new organizations are still being formed, to come in as an early implementer, which might be able to direct the emergence of these organizations in Egypt's own interest, as well as obviously as the others. So I think it's a good move by Egypt, a good move by Russia. Obviously there is economic trade to be done there, and indeed they both feel the need to show the world that they are moving on and getting on with the road to economic prosperity.
Mr. Ismail, as Mr. Gacic was saying, it's a shift to the east perhaps, but then this happens before in Egypt. Can you tell us more historically before, when it was a very strong alliance with Moscow?
Well, the strong alliance with Moscow was actually during the time of the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And that shifted after the peace treaty with Israel under the influence of the American. Now we're actually probably dealing with a different set of circumstances, because the Soviet Union does not exist as it did 30 odd years ago. Now we're dealing with a new power, which is, in my view, is an emerging power, despite the difficulties.
Is there no nostalgia, though, to what was happening before, at the times of the Soviet Union? Don't you think President Abdel-Fattah al-Sissi is a bit nostalgic to this era?
I don't think so. He's a bit of a realist, in my view. He's an army general. He comes from a similar background to Putin in terms of the Secret Service and so on and so forth. They both understand the need for both countries to work together to open new markets and new opportunities for both of them. So I feel this is not just about nostalgia, it is about reality. The world now has completely changed to when the Soviet Union existed. The threat of extremism, which the Russian Federation, I think, has suffered as well during the Chechnyan rebellion. So the Russians have an experience in dealing with a situation like that. And I think the ISIS represents an opportunity not only for Russia in terms of arms sales, but also training personnel both in Egypt, and also the support, the massive logistic support that is being given to both Syria and Iran at this moment. So I think Sisi, in my view, has read the situation quite well. He sees Russia now not as the Soviet Union was in its support to Egypt during the Suez Canal conflict and Israeli-Arab conflict, but he sees it in terms of what is happening now on the ground. Egypt is surrounded by uncertainty in terms of what's happening in Libya, what's happening in Hamas, and what's happening in Sudan. And Sudan perhaps is a little bit softer than what is situation in Libya at the moment, and also what's happening in Yemen. That affects Egypt economically in terms of the control of these waterways. So I think the Sisi has read the situation quite well. It isn't about nostalgia, it is about the future of both countries influencing what's happening on the ground.
In the region. Yeah. And what do you think of the style of the visit? It's clearly a full charm offensive there.
Yeah. I think the way I see it is trying to probably antagonize the American. It's a very high profile.
From Sisi's behalf, or both of them?
Probably both of them. And I think they're playing to the cameras. They're playing to both audience in Russia and in Egypt. It's showing that Egypt is willing to open the doors to those who want to invest in Egypt. And the visit comes in a very important juncture for the Egyptian economy, with the coming conference in Sharm el-Sheikh, I think it's in March. That obviously sends a strong message to those who want to invest in Egypt that the Russian economy is willing to invest in a country that has, over the past 3-4 years, had a lot of problems. It's a vote of confidence, I think.
I see. And Mr. Gacic, were you satisfied with the West's media coverage of the trip? On many outlets, we've seen both presidents even ridiculed.
Well, I think that's a bit cheap and desperate on the part of the media industry here, which is obviously a servant of the power here, which is determined to present Russia as an isolated country, pressured from all sides and unable to operate an independent foreign policy. So really what we have here is the proof that that isn't the case, that Russia's very much on the world stage. It's recently had its new pipeline agreed with Turkey. Its relations with Iran are very good. Its relations with the Syrian government are very good. And here, Egypt as well. So Russia, in a sense, has pivoted away from the US and the EU, and they don't like it very much. And I should say, in a kind of way, Egypt has done a little bit of a pivot as well.
But does that justify calling the Egyptian president a chubby guy, or calling them going on a romantic dinner even just because they sat alone on the table? What do you think about media standards recently?
I think ridicule is the weapon of the man without an argument. And here, clearly, they do not have anything to say. It's clearly an advantageous trip for both parties. It's clearly not something that they will benefit from. So, of course, they will set their tame pet poodles in the media to produce a different message. But as I say, they have no answers to the facts on the ground. Economic cooperation is a good thing. Cooperation between peoples and nations is a good thing. So all they can do is ridicule individuals to try and delegitimize the whole thing and stop people thinking about the significance of this new, fresh Egyptian-Russian understanding.
Mr. Ismail, billions of dollars worth of guns and tanks, and quite probably an anti-terrorist alliance. Which one do you think is President Putin showing off more on this visit? Is it the fact that he can resist EU sanctions by finding markets elsewhere, or the anti-ISIS campaign that might overshadow the US-led coalition?
I think it's the whole thing, in my view. It is not just one thing. They are all important for both parties. ISIS does represent the growth of ISIS, if it is left unchecked, will affect the Russian as well. They have a huge minority, Muslim minority, and they will be absolutely within their right to deal with the ISIS before it spreads over the borders. So in terms of the economics, there is obviously a market for, and it's a huge market, for armament. Egypt have seen during Sisi income into power, the American have switched the tap of the weaponry off. They stopped for a short period the financial package to Egypt, which was agreed under the peace treaty. Now Egypt, I think, in a position where it wants to diversify its armament. And it does not have to rely on one source of armament. I think it is to the benefit of the Russian, obviously, to find new markets for their armaments. That will help in two fronts. First one would be trying to circumvent the boycott by the European Union and the economic boycott by the European Union and the American, and in the same time they found a new market for their weaponry. We've seen now delivery to Iraq as well. So I think the Russians are quite proactive in that area, and the Egyptian army is not a foreign army to the Russian armament. It was fully armed during the October War. And the victory of the October War by Russian and Soviet armament at that time. So I think it is not new, but it is actually revitalizing the relationship and capitalizing on the opportunity that exists at the moment.
Mr. Gassage, an analyst, argues, quote, that a Russian leader known for his cynicism can only enjoy meeting a military autocrat who was elected president after staging a successful coup d'etat against a previously elected president. He's referring here to President el-Sissi of Egypt. And he continues, even the old Soviet Union could never quite achieve this, unquote. That was Robert Fisk, of course. Would you share the same views?
Well, no. What I would say is that the Western countries have never shied from supporting people who are politically incorrect as long as they're viewed as good allies for them in their economic imperialism. So I think it's the pot claiming that the kettle is black, as we say in England. I think the significant thing, I would just, from what Mr. Ismail was saying, I would continue, this is a deal between nations, not between two presidents. It's two nations that will benefit here. So the key thing, we can always find problems associated with elections in many countries supported by the West, but the point is what is being done here is of benefit to both nations. And what I would highlight is the point for Egypt of the preferential trade terms that it will get as entering into this free trade agreement with the Eurasian Union, because one key thing there is wheat, the security of supply for Egypt, which is a huge consumer of wheat, is guaranteed to the largest possible extent by being a friend, effectively, of the Eurasian Union. So when Russia, for example, meets its own supply needs, who will it turn to next to supply? To its friends. If Egypt is one of its friends, then Egypt is in that way guaranteeing its own security of supply, as opposed to a couple of years ago when all the social problems were partly due to the food shortages and the food poverty created by open market wheat price increases. So this is an agreement of benefit to both nations, both peoples, and in that sense is of benefit to humanity. This personalization again of presidents and the way they came is typical delegitimizing tactics by a Western media industry.
And now we are joined by British political commentator David Lowley-Wakelin. Welcome to our discussion this evening. David, how would you look at the tenure of President Abdel-Fattah al-Sissi of Egypt so far?
Well, you know, they haven't had a great human rights record, locking up 500 supporters of Morsi in a 5-minute trial, where many of them are still on death row waiting a death sentence. Yes. Then releasing the old Mubarak, you know, the old military dictator, even though he'd absconded, was still missing around 134 billion of Egypt's money, plus of course the hundreds of people he killed during the revolution of 2011. Yes. You know, that alone with, freezing the assets of all the opposition bank accounts, he's just as bad as Sisi as Mubarak was. In fact, knock out the old guard, bring in the new guard. It's just a different name under the same regime, as far as I can see. And
do you think, David, that human rights and freedoms of speech would have been better off under the Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, no, that's perhaps not, but that's not the point. The point is they were elected. They were elected in a proper election, and they were then taken out, even though they did write, they wrote a pretty asinine constitution, which would have brought in many more religious powers. That's as may be, but it was up to the people to get them thrown out, not for the old military regime to just step back in. Yes. Of course, Morsi
stay with us, David. I'll ask Mr. Ismail here about the Muslim Brotherhood, as we touched on that. Mr. Ismail, what do you think of the freedoms of speech? We see a lot of criticism now of President al-Sisi when it comes to cracking down on the former figures from the Muslim Brotherhood. What about the practices under the Muslim Brotherhood? Why did the West fail to cover them?
Well, I'm not particularly concerned about how the West feels about what's happening in Egypt. It is for the Egyptian people to feel that and to decide that. We're not going to enter into this argument whether it was a coup or a revolution or whatever it was. But the Egyptian in general have felt that the elected president, President Morsi, and his entourage, including his party, they set out to change the entire nation of Egypt. They wanted to become a caliphate. This is not what they were elected for. They were elected to solve the problems that the Egyptian have suffered from over 40, 50 years of bad management of the economy. They were elected to improve the lot of the Egyptian. They were elected to uphold the law. They did nothing in that. They wrote their own constitution, as David have just referred to, which would have brought the country backwards, not forward. The Egyptian, but in general, and you really need to understand the Egyptian mentality before you start judging what happened.
And when it comes to that understanding, why did the West, particularly the media, even academia, fail to understand that it was not a unilateral coup by Abdel-Fattah al-Sisi in June 2013? Did they not see the people in the streets similar to 2011, to the 25th of the January revolution? Why did they dismiss all these people and decided it was just a coup by Abdel-Fattah al-Sisi?
Yeah, I think it is in the interest of the West to see a Muslim Brotherhood who would literally tear a country apart. We've seen what's happening in Syria at the moment. There is an American think tank, and I can't remember the name of that think tank for the minute, that they 20 years ago designed a new Middle East, where Israel would be the dominant power in the area. Okay. And the new countries, which is divided between smaller and smaller units, would literally be easy for Israel to deal with. The break of Egypt as a country, the break of Libya as a country, the break of what's happening now in front of us. We see it in Iraq and Syria.
Let's get back to David Lowley. What does this even more established alliance between Russia and Egypt tell us about Russia's role in the Middle East vis-à-vis the role of the West in the region?
Well, this just comes at a time when Russia needs to show the West, show America, that right on Israel's doorstep it has an ally. In its current aggression or America's aggression in Ukraine, this is an opportunity just to show America, look, you may be able to come onto my doorstep through Ukraine, but I can also come onto your doorstep next to Israel with one of my allies. So it's it's a show of force, and also it's a big deal. They're making a big deal, and they are going to do tremendous business with this power plant, this nuclear power plant that they are going to be going into business with Egypt with, which is a massive contract. And there will also be armaments, as there has been through history. It's not just American arms. And in this case, I think that Sisi is showing some strength because he's able to deal with both America and Russia at the same time. He does accept 1.3 billion every year from America straight into the military bank account, and he does keep the Rafah crossing into Israel closed, probably as part of that payment, but at the same time he's able to deal with Russia. So he's showing quite good leadership here, I think.
David Lowley, also documentary filmmaker of the alternative Iraq inquiry, accusing former British Labour Party Prime Minister of being a war criminal. Many thanks for being on the show.
No, pleasure, thank you.
Ms. Ismail, speaking of the Labour Party, what are the stances nowadays over the Middle East and particularly Egypt?
I think at the coming election, actually, would maybe the party is still formulating its new foreign policy when it takes office, hopefully after the election of May, which is hopefully we're going to win. I think the vote in the House of Commons 2 or 3 months ago in regards of the acknowledgement of the state of Palestine as a country would be it's
an unbinding.
Well, it is an unbinding, but I think there is a commitment by Ed Miliband to effect that once the government, a new government, which I keep saying hopefully it would be Labour, and you wouldn't expect me to say any less than that.
Of course.
So I think the new policy in terms of foreign policy would be built on an openness and an honest approach, with obviously the interest, the mutual interest between different countries that Britain can influence in one way or another, or can be influenced by those countries, particularly in the Middle East. And I name Israel as one.
Yes. Mr. Gacic, when it comes to touching on Britain a little bit, obviously we do expect what would Ed Miliband do if the Labour Party won the coming elections. We sort of predict also if the Conservatives won, but what about UKIP, and what would they have to say about the situation in the Middle East, and what's their policy there? We know about their policy in Europe, definitely, but what about their policy, do you think, in the Middle East? Would they do any better?
Well, I rather like UKIP's general position on illegal wars abroad. They're fairly clear. They don't like them. They wouldn't have Britain in them. And in that sense, they're unequivocal in a way. Blair's Britain was had its illegal wars in Iraq and in Yugoslavia. And we've got Cameron, who's almost as bad in attacking Libya and wanting to attack Syria and so on. So there is a bit of history here which Britain needs to overcome, especially given its imperialist past and its slight liking for global coercion in international affairs, where they point a finger at their proposed victim and then demand compliance. This is not the way to win friends in the world, and it reminds people of the old British Empire, perhaps. So I like the alternative, which Farage's Britain, which would refrain from illegal wars abroad, is very appealing to me. Indeed, he's not the only one on the British territory. I mean, Alex Salmond in the Scottish National Party is also principled in that way. So it's funny that people tarred with kind of like some nationalist labels are actually very internationalist in their respect for international rule of law and not international might as opposed to right.
But is it a realistic view of the world that we live in? And I wonder if they have actually been honest with the people of Britain, because Britain has carried over the years really a huge responsibility in its shoulders in terms of combating terrorism, what happened in Kuwait as well. We would have had.
Yeah, but that's different. That was with UN backing. That was that was an invasion that they took steps against, and it had the backing of the United Nations Security Council. It operated through the UN framework. It was an entirely legal operation. The ones that followed have been the opposite, and that's where my concern is with them.
So basically, why did the West, Mr. Ismail, not come to terms yet with what happened in the Middle East in general, not just Egypt? We've seen also in Tunisia now that the secularists have won the elections. They do consider Tunisia, for example, as a role model in democracy, but you can tell that deep down in the media, they're not really keen that the secularists have won. And that also applies to Egypt. Now, what do you have to say about that?
I think, again, because it does not fall within the plans that has been formulated 20 years ago for the Middle East, a new Middle East that manageable, to free the Americans to pursue and to try to limit the influence in the Chinese influence in Pacific. And the Indian Ocean, I think it is. Sorry, my geography isn't as good. So, but I think this is a rising concern for the Chinese represent a huge challenge for them in this area, and they want to free themselves from what's happening in the Middle East, because it does hinder them. Looking at the Chinese problem for them. So the policymaker over the past 20 years, and this is a general feeling actually in the Middle East, that there is a plan to break down countries that exist after the First World War in the Middle East to smaller units that Israel can deal with. And I think obviously Iran and Turkey and also now Egypt would perhaps not accept these new plans, and we see the result of it now is in Syria.
Syria's resisting
and
as
Iraq.
Well. Yes. Mr. Gacic, for President Putin, this was about strengthening his political ties and economic base in Egypt, and to use it strategically to access Sudan, Ethiopia, and Libya. Some argue that it's all about the defense market in North Africa. That's one motive of his visit to Egypt. Now, to what extent could this visit be seen in that way when it comes to North Africa?
Well, I think one thing that's happened in Africa recently is the kind of increased interest, probably because, as Mr. Ismail says, because of China becoming more involved in Africa to get resources from Africa, but providing to Africa infrastructure and many positive benefits. So America has retaliated in a way by creating its own AFRICOM command designed to control the future development of the situation. And it may be that Mr. Putin, President Putin, is here putting Russia's flag down in this freshly uncharted territory as well, to say we have an interest here, and if there is going to be discussion about the future of this area, we also have a presence as any other power could expect. So
there's a race to the region, basically.
Well, it could be a little bit like an African version of the Arctic race for resources. It could be the African version.
But it also, just to add, to complement the point that you made quite excellently, is that the fact, if we look at the history, when Egypt opened its doors to the Soviet Union all those years back, it was open the door for the rest of the Middle East as well as Africa. And I think this is, again, Egypt is pivotal in this. And I think that will probably herald the involvement in of Russia into Africa in a greater measures, especially now we see the American, they're only interested in containing a situation which they can be managed, nothing else, but not solve the problems of those. Sorry.
No, that's absolutely. I think their key interest is in, as they said themselves, I think it was Paul Wolfowitz who said that their aim was to deprive the Chinese of access to resources which would fuel their emergence as a potential rival to the United States. And I think it was Madeleine Albright who said they would do anything to maintain their global position, which means staying number one, which means keeping everyone else down. So it is a geostrategic and geopolitical on the part of the Americans, their involvement in Africa, and obviously that will raise a response among other powers as well.
And now let's go to Moscow to speak to former Russian diplomat and political analyst Dr. Vyacheslav Matozov. Welcome to our discussion on Straightforward here in London. Dr. Matozov.
Thank you. Good evening.
Dr. Matozov, what are the impressions in Moscow over President Putin's visit to Egypt?
Well, it is a very big event in Russian foreign policy. It is more important that it was laid down in media in Russian and in the world, because it means for Russians, it means a principal change of direction of Russian foreign policy as a whole. Because previously decades, after dissolving the Soviet Union, Russian presidents, Russian administration were oriented more and more on the United States, on Europe, and it was considered absolutely legally that the main country in the world, Russia interested in developing relations, is the United States. Now Russia understands on public level and on governmental level and presidential level. They understood one simple thing. America is not a partner. America is a country, independent, and Russia is independent countries. America has their own interests and Russia has its own. And they separated on this problem because, as we understand, the American influence in Russia, inside Russia, in Europe, in the world, in Asia, is contradicted with Russian interests in all over the world.
Is there a way, Dr. Matozov,
Egypt.
Is there a way that these interests could overlap so that the relations could be reconciled at some point?
I don't think that a reconstruction relation or repairing relations with the United States now is possible, because the difference is too deep.
Yes.
And Russia made a very important change, their goals on foreign policy. Orientation on the East, on this Asia. They considered now main country Russia wants to be partners to develop relations, economical, political. It is China.
Yes.
They are now trying to improve their relations with India. And through Egypt, Russia is trying to establish the political bridge for all Islamic world, for all Arab countries.
Yes.
And that means that Russia has absolutely serious intention when it pay visit to Egypt. And I think that all our relations in economy, in policy, in many other fields of political life will be oriented on one issue, to develop relations with Arab world. Egypt, Gulf states, and of course with other Islamic countries like Iran, like Syria, like Northern Africa.
Yes.
I think that it is very deep concern of Russia that was burned by American policy in the Middle East, where
Yes.
we watch all these tragic developments in Iraq, in Libya, in Yemen, in Syria, and we understand that it is going on Russian southern frontiers. And in this case, Russia should work more actively than it was previous decade.
But Dr. Matuzov, there has been some criticism for President Putin so as to the timing of his visit. Now he is a president stuck in a major crisis when it comes to Ukraine, sanctions from the EU and all that, and then he goes and decides to do a 2-day trip to Egypt. What do you think about the timing of the trip?
This is not correct judgment. First of all, of course, Ukraine is a headache for Russia and it influence on Russian economical situation, but it is not a real react of Russia on events, because they pushed Russia for better understanding where is American foreign policy is and what their goals concerning Russia. And they came to the conclusion that these goals are to not to let Russia to return as a big power, not to let her to develop in the way Russia wants, and restrictions and so on.
Yes.
I don't consider that all measures in economic that undertaken by the United States will effectively influence on Russian economy.
Stay with us one moment, Dr. Matuzov. Dr. Matuzov, stay with us. Let's see Mr. Marko Gasic here, if he would add on what you just said.
Yeah, well, I would agree with a lot of what the doctor said, and add one extra element that, of course, one reason why perhaps the bridges have broken between Russia and America is because Russia is now under this American pressure heading towards a world of de-dollarization, where with China, with others, with Egypt now as well, there's this movement. It's effectively, the US has been creating money for free, and people have had to buy billions of dollars because in order to trade between themselves, which is an absurd system which can only benefit a party which is not even present in those trading arrangements. So it is a natural and logical that there should be an effort to trade in one's own currencies, and that's what's happening now, and that obviously does not suit the US of A, and that is indeed one reason why there's this accelerated program of pressure against Russia and against any country that does turn away from the dollar. It is a little bit of a risky strategy, I have to warn everybody.
Dr. Matuzov, tell us a little bit about what this trip could mean to Damascus, particularly to President Bashar al-Assad.
Well, the Russian view on developments on Syrian scene is stable from the very beginning of the Syrian crisis. Syria is the subject object of international conspiracy, because all what is going on in Syria is very clearly laid down in American WikiLeaks telegrams of American ambassador in Damascus, dated 2010, 2009.
Yes.
They saying that
Yes.
Oh, they're saying that.
Yes, Dr. Matuzov. Dr. Matuzov, former Russian diplomat, political analyst, thank you very much for joining us from Moscow today. Mr. Gacic, what are the implications of Putin's visit from the Israeli angle, especially when it comes to empowering the Egyptian army now?
Well, I personally don't think that Israel will be excessively concerned by the deals that are being made. Of course, it doesn't like it when its regional potential opponents are strengthened with alliances with major world powers. But I think certainly in the short term, there is, I see no danger of conflict between Israel and anyone in the Middle East at the moment. And Israel has a very powerful sponsor. So I don't see a great deal of concern on the arms issue personally, but perhaps Mr. Ismail may have another view.
Yeah, no, I agree with you. But it is also the adage of the peace treaty. Peace treaty is quite clear, and it's quite unequivocal in that sense. This is a peace treaty that has been literally bankrolled by the Americans, and I don't think the Egyptian will, at this stage, will venture anything. I don't think the Israeli will have too much to worry about in the immediate future, and I probably would say in sort of medium term as well, because the Egyptian army is not in the same strength that it was in 1973, and it would not represent a huge problem, a challenge to Israel. The challenge will come from the political strength of a regional power, which is Egypt.
Mr. Ismail, just before we wrap up, are we going to see a power plant in Egypt? And is this the beginning of a real new axis in the Middle East?
I think so. And I think Egypt has made it quite clear, unofficially, that it would, at some stage, the policymakers will want to see a development that might lead in the near future to nuclear bombs. I don't think the Americans have turned their. They'll probably given a hint and a wink. Would the Egyptian go that far? That is only the future. The future can tell. But in terms of power. Nuclear power, I think Egypt's problem now exists in terms of the energy sector, where we see daily power cuts across Egypt. And if Egypt is quite ambitious in terms of the development and economic development, it needs resources such as the nuclear power. So it is, in the long term, cheaper than oil. The prices of oil keeps fluctuating. It doesn't help the planners, the economic planners. And certainly Egypt, in the growth market in Egypt in terms of the population as well as the investment that Egypt want to attract, which investor that will go to our country when they are not quite sure whether they have power today or tomorrow. So I think it is important for Egypt to, at least to be seen that it is addressing its problems. In terms of energy.
Marko Gacic, what's your final say? You seem to be very positive about the trip.
Well, yeah, I think it's a positive trip, positive for the world, positive for the parties involved, a good solution to various problems they have, both in practical terms and in image terms. I think it's a success in all respects. One thing I would add, though, is with Mr. Sisi's government, it would make sense if 500 people are being held still for alleged crimes that they were tried individually, not en masse, because that will be used against his government if anything negative happens to them on the basis of a fairly superficial trial process.
I guess there's so much to say, but we will have to bring this to an end this evening. Let me thank our guests here at the studio, Mr. Omar Ismail, British-Egyptian political analyst and also chair of the British Arab Group at the Labour Party. Thank you very much for coming. And Mr. Marko Gacic of the British-Serbian Alliance for Peace and political analyst as well. Thank you for coming. And our other interlocutors who joined us over the phone from Moscow, Dr. Vyacheslav Matuzov, former Russian diplomat and political analyst, and via Skype from London, political commentator David Lowley-Wakeland. As to Egypt, analysts argue by withdrawing support to its ally in Egypt, the US opened opportunities for Putin, an anti-Western player, to gain influence at the expense of US interests. And in what was somewhat seen as a theatrical trip, President Putin travels the world showing the West he's no persona non grata, while Egyptian President Abdel-Fattah al-Sissi could signal not that he's turning away from the US, but that he has other options. On this notion by Anna Borshevskaya of the Washington Institute, I will leave you this evening. Stay tuned and I'll see you again soon on Straightforward, and bye for now. Hello, welcome to Straightforward, Levant TV's political debate show looking at issues in the Middle East. President Putin's visit to Egypt continued as his counterpart Abdel-Fattah al-Sissi rolled out more red carpet in Cairo. Throughout this full charm offensive, the two leaders are discussing a boost in trade ties and possibly dumping the US dollar, switching to their national currencies for bilateral trade. And one of the biggest deals on the table is a multi-billion-dollar arms deal. Let me now welcome our guest here at the studio, Egyptian-British political analyst, Mr. Omar Ismail. Thank you very much for being on the show. And Mr. Marco Gasic, political analyst. Thank you very much as well. Before we get into looking at this visit and its regional and global implications, let's have a look at this brief report on this top Middle East event this week.
Egyptian President Abdel-Fattah al-Sisi welcomed Russia's President Vladimir Putin this week in Cairo as the two leaders sought to strengthen ties between the two nations.
The BRIC countries with the Shanghai Cooperation Council, so it's a chance for Egypt to come in early and perhaps while the rules of these new organizations are still being formed, to come in as an early implementer, which might be able to direct the emergence of these organizations in Egypt's own interest, as well as obviously as the others. So I think it's a good move by Egypt, a good move by Russia. Obviously there is economic trade to be done there, and indeed they both feel the need to show the world that they are moving on and getting on with the road to economic prosperity.
Mr. Ismail, as Mr. Gasic was saying, it's a shift to the east perhaps, but then this happens before in Egypt. Can you tell us more historically before, when it was a very strong alliance with Moscow?
Well, the strong alliance with Moscow was actually during the time of the Soviet Union.
Yes.
And that shifted after the peace treaty with Israel under the influence of the American. Now we're actually probably dealing with a different set of circumstances, because the Soviet Union does not exist as it did 30 odd years ago. Now we're dealing with a new power, which is, in my view, is an emerging power, despite the difficulties.
Is there no nostalgia, though, to what was happening before?
The Russian leader was given a 21-gun salute as he was driven through the driveway of the presidential palace, flanked by soldiers on horseback. He was greeted by Sisi and cheering children waving the Russian flag and an off-key rendition of Russia's national anthem. Several Cairo highways were lined with posters of Mr. Putin's face, and he was given a hero's welcome in the state-run media. The meeting of the leaders was exceptionally warm. After holding talks at Cairo's international airport, both leaders proceeded to Cairo Opera House for a cultural evening and were then snapped enjoying what appeared to be a romantic meal for two, overlooking views of the Nile. United by a deep hostility toward Islamists, Egypt's President Abdel-Fattah al-Sisi and Russia's Vladimir Putin said they were both committed to fighting the threat of terrorism. The general and the former KGB officer found common ground on security at talks in Cairo that signaled a rapprochement between their two countries, at a time when relations between Egypt and the United States have cooled. Putin, making his first state visit to Egypt in a decade, said they agreed on reinforcing efforts in combating terrorism. Officials say the warmth of Mr. Putin's welcome does not signal a shift in Cairo's foreign policy, with a Western diplomat saying historically Egypt has been playing this game before, when it shifted between the Soviets and the Americans. They are both playing nations against each other.
Energy in terms of the nuclear power, generating electricity, as well as the investment in the infrastructure in Egypt, and likewise investment in Russia by Egyptian, which it would help the two economies. And the fact that the two countries as well agreed to ditch the dollar it helped both countries. But I'm not quite sure on how far that would go.
Marko Gasic, do you think this was a much needed visit, particularly at this moment on time?
Well, it's one of those interesting moments in history when perhaps we've got a change from one system to another. I mean, you've got the Western economic model hasn't worked for perhaps Egypt as we've seen over the last decades, over a period of successive rulers. You could say that Egypt is looking for a new idea, and the new idea may well be to turn eastward and to engage with a new trading blocks that are going to be formed, because I think for Egypt, as for many countries, it would be very difficult to be outside these trading blocks once they start making arrangements which are to their own benefit. So Egypt now has the benefit of being not only effectively in the Eurasian Union, but also linked in that way through Russia as one of the main players in that union with.
Mr. Omar Ismail, how do you look at this President Putin's visit to Egypt?
I think the visit itself carries a significant importance to both countries, challenges in both countries. Egypt is facing horrendous terrorism, and the economy is not doing as well as it should do. Russia too has having problem as far as the Balkan, and obviously the action that the American and the European are taking against what's happening in Ukraine. So the two countries now, I think, they found themselves in a difficult position, and I think the visit itself would help economically in terms of development, moving the relationship forward. The economic, I call it the economic soft power that would create perhaps a strategic partnership between Egypt and the Russian Federation in the foreseeable future, particularly in the field of energy, which is Egypt suffers from electricity cuts, as we know, the need for renewable